Good evening, everyone. My name is Yilok, and I'm a researcher at the Social Inclusion Project and a part of the Minimum Income Standard Research Team. I'm your MC today. Welcome to the project launch of the Minimum Income Standard 2023 report. Thank you for making the time to be here. The first study on the cost of a basic standard of living in Singapore using the Minimum Income Standard method, or MIS in short, was published in 2019, focusing on older people. A follow-up study on working-age households with children was completed in 2021. In total, the researchers conducted focus groups discussions with almost 300 participants from diverse backgrounds. In recent times, high inflation has sparked anxiety among Singaporeans, raising concerns about living costs and standard of living. Low-income households and older people have been the most hard hit by the inflation and low income growth. Within this context, the MIS research team updated the household budgets to capture the impact of inflation. The MIS research team consists of Dr. Ang Kok Ho, Assistant Professor Tu Yu Yuan, Dr. Niu Yu Wei, and Dr. Art Malnod, and Dr. Stephanie Chok, and myself. The report will be launched on MIS website later this evening. It's titled Minimum Income Standard 2023, Household Budgets in a Time of Rising Costs. The study this time presents the budgets that different households in Singapore needs amidst rising costs. By comparing the budgets with actual incomes, wage interventions, and other public schemes, the latest report answered two main questions. First, have wage changes been instrumental in safeguarding people's basic income needs? And second, have public schemes intervened to alleviate the burden of inflation, especially on vulnerable households? In today's event, Dr. Ang and Assistant Professor Tu will take us through the key findings and highlights of these studies. Dr. Ang Kok Ho is the Senior Research Fellows and Head of the Social Inclusion Project, as well as the Case Study Unit at the Kuan School of Public Policy. Professor Tu is the Provost Chair at the Nanyang Technological University. Now, I first invite Professor Tu to present. Professor Tu, please.
Hi, good evening. Really nice to see so many of you here. Thank you so much for your interest in our work. So we first started conceptualizing minimum income standards research, MIS, in 2016. And this was the context. Members of this team, we were each doing research on poverty and inequality, and we were grappling with the challenge of addressing this question. If poverty and inequality are problems, what are solutions? There are various ways to answer the question, and no single piece of research or data can accomplish the task entirely. But we saw that there was one key puzzle we needed to address. If in a society of wealth and abundance, some people are deprived, do not have enough, and cannot meet their needs, what exactly is enough? What is a basic standard of living in Singapore today? We decided that to tackle the question of how to solve problems of poverty and inequality, we need a baseline, a standard to guide thinking about basic needs. And once you ask the question of basic needs, you also encounter the tricky questions of enough for whom? And even more importantly, according to whom? By what criteria should we determine what is or isn't enough? Who is to say what is a basic need and what is not? Is it experts? Is it the government or ordinary people? On this, the MIS approach lands firmly on the answer, ordinary people. The approach we decided on is that to figure out what a basic standard of living in Singapore today is, we should ask ordinary Singaporeans. We therefore used a series of focus group discussions. Those are our participants. to figure out how do ordinary Singaporeans think about basic needs, what they are, why they matter, how they are different for different household types and at different times in life, and what items and budgets people need to meet these needs. As Elok mentioned, we published 2 reports. One focused on the needs of older persons, and another focused on the needs of households with children. I hope some of you have already read our reports, and that those of you who haven't will be interested to do so after today. Today's launch will be focused on the more numerical findings from our work, the various household budgets and how they compare to wages and compare to public schemes. But please keep in mind a few other things we found that are the backdrop to these numbers. First, basic needs go beyond mere survival. They encompass needs for belonging, respect, independence, security, social participation. We found deep consensus on this, that these are constituent parts of basic needs, not wants, not luxuries. Second, while these seem like abstract needs, they have material components. So, for example, the need for respect among the elderly means that they need budgets that would allow them to bring appropriate gifts when they attend a social event. Third, what is basic is context-specific and relational. They are shaped by how others in society live, what norms exist that regulate social life. People also care not just about meeting their own basic needs, but also the needs of the people they care for and care about. Finally, while we took a leap of faith going in, we certainly emerged from our work convinced that ordinary people are able to come together to build consensus about what enough is. This matters especially if we return to our original hope of figuring out solutions, because it suggests that there's great potential for establishing a baseline that people can get behind. So while doing this research, in the hours we spent puzzling out how best to run focus group discussions, when we wandered the aisles of neighborhood shops looking at prices of soup spoons and sponges, as we read and reread transcripts and studied spreadsheets and charts, we also wondered, if we build it, will anyone come? Will this research that we find so compelling and useful also resonate with others? And I'm grateful to say that after we built it, people did indeed show up. Thanks to many people over the last few years who've taken an interest in this research, who've engaged with it in a variety of ways, it seems to us that the public discourse around basic needs has shifted. Today, we feel we don't have to do as much to convince you that baselines and standards are important, that ordinary people's views can inform the forming of baselines, and that social participation, dignity, respect, autonomy are important to integrate into our definition of basic standards of living. If we care to address the problems of poverty and inequality, these are crucial ingredients to solutions. So the context has shifted a little. Given that our work over the past years, given the shift in public discourse, the context that motivates the current report is slightly different. What motivates the current uprating exercise is an effort to better understand the conditions we face coming out of 3 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. These were years when inequality received a great deal of attention. Much has been said about structural changes that need to happen to build back better. It is a context where high levels of inflation have meant intensified cost of living anxieties, and where we have much to worry about when it comes to people not meeting basic needs. The problem we began with all those years ago, about needing a baseline and standard to better understand the problem and to target solutions, is more important than ever. It is also a context in which there has been a lot of policy activity, where many new schemes have been introduced, and we think it is timely to scrutinize these. So we addressed 3 key questions in our report. How much income do people need to meet basic standards of living? How do real incomes in Singapore today fare relative to these basic needs budgets? And importantly, finally, how do recent public policy measures fare when evaluated against MIS baselines? And now Kok Ho will take you through these findings. Thank you.
Thanks, Yu Yan, and hello everyone. Very, very nice to be meeting you to share results from our minimum income standards research again. Like Yu Yan mentioned, this report updates the findings from previous rounds of this study. So out of the earlier focus groups, we produced spreadsheets of items. Those individual items were priced using actual price data in shops and online. And all those spreadsheets are available on our study website. Right? So this specific edition of the report focuses on what has happened to these budgets due to inflation and policy changes. So the way we went about this exercise, uprating, adjusting the budgets in response to inflation, is through several ways. The first is, of course, to refer to the Consumer Price Index. The latest edition is the 2022 one. So for most items, we revised the prices based on 2022 CPI. And we didn't just adopt the all items CPI. For those of you who are familiar, we went through each line item in our that makes up our budget, and then we matched it to the relevant category and then used the category-specific CPI to revise the price. So that was done to most items. And then there were some exceptions. For public services that were newly introduced or which new rates of subsidies were announced, we actually know the new rate, so we just applied this rather than the CPI. And then housing is a particularly complex area. We explained the methodology in our previous reports. Essentially, we adopt a series of, well, first of all, what participants say about the size of flats they need. So we construct housing scenarios based on people's space needs, and then we apply the existing housing rules to calculate housing costs. We also incorporate actual prices in BTO launches, resale flat data, as well as rental statistics. So we feed all this through, and that was how we updated the housing component of the budgets this time around. So that's a lot of preamble, right? So these are the numbers after the most recent round of revision. So again, we were adjusting based on inflation that has taken place between 2020 and 2022, right? Because that's the latest data that we have. Inflation during this period was 8.6%. As for the minimum income standard budgets, the budgets from our study, these have increased as well, but the increase has been gentler. It's 4 to 5%. Right? We focus on 3 indicative household types. We pick these 3 to provide some diversity in terms of housing size and composition. So we have a single parent with 1 child, aged 2 to 6, a couple with 2 children, aged between 7 and 18, and then a single elderly person aged 65 and above. So the latest budget numbers are, for a single elderly person to meet basic needs, 1,492 per month. And then for the single parent with 1 child, around 3,300. And then for the couple with 2 children, around 6,600. So these are the latest figures. Just a quick kind of comparison with what has actually happened in terms of inflation within the economy. Because we drew not just from the CPI, the increases in the MIS budgets were not exactly the same as in the CPI. So in some areas, increases in actual prices within the CPI have exceeded the increases in the same category of our MIS budgets. Transport is a key example. Inflation, so actual price inflation in the category of transport in the Singapore economy over this period was 26.7%, quite staggering. But within our budgets, the transport component only went up by 4.9%, reason being The MIS budgets are for basic needs, so it's based on the cost of public transport. Right? The most serious inflation within the economy are due to private vehicles and petrol. Right? So of course, these are not covered by our MIS budgets. So there are small variations like this, but for the most part, the MIS budget changes have picked up what has happened in the rest of the economy. So how do we make sense of these numbers, right? Let's do a series of comparisons. The first thing to compare them to is, of course, wage, so work income. This chart shows the distribution of work income averaged on a per household member basis, and then grouped by income deciles, right? So from the lowest 10% of working households to the highest 10%, and then we compared it to the revised MIS budgets. You can see the horizontal line meets the bar chart at the third decile group. What this chart means is that around 30% of working households still earn less than MIS budgets, so what they need for basic needs. This is similar to the situation in 2020. We can break down wage data further by occupation, type of work, and education. Right? But no matter how we reconfigure the data, the dual problem with wages still exists. So we are talking about wage inequality across groups, as well as wage inadequacy at the bottom of the distribution. For example, in the lowest paid occupational group, cleaners, laborers, and related workers, their median work income in 2022 reached only half of the income they need to meet basic needs. Whereas in the highest earning occupational group of managers and administrators, actual work incomes were 3 times the MIS budgets. Right? So this is despite, you can see small income gains. The lighter colored bars are from 2020. The darker bars in each pair are from 2022. So you can see small income gains, but they have not altered the overall shape of our income distribution, nor the dual problems of inequality and inadequacy. For older workers, we need to look at a slightly different set of data because older workers earn a lot less than younger workers in our economy. So instead of referring to wage data for all workers, we look at the wage data for older workers. Here, you will see perhaps the only bright spot in the analysis this time around is that for the category of cleaners, laborers, and related workers, for the first time since we started doing this work, the actual wages have surpassed what they need for basic needs. So that is, as represented by the chart, is where the bar has gone further to the right of the MIS budget line. Right? But it's not much. Right? And the overall pattern of inequality across occupational groups and educational levels still exist. What about wage interventions? So what I've just showed you is actual wage data, and then there is wage interventions. So due to persistent low wages in recent years, we have seen 2 major interventions. One is, of course, a progressive wage model, which sets up a wage ladder in selected occupations and sectors, and then the workfare income supplement, which is a wage top-up. So if we look at the theoretical wage levels that are possible to achieve under a combination of these 2 measures, PWM and WIS, then we can compare them to the MIS budgets. Those are the ratios on the right-hand side of the table. The picture is quite clear. Between PWM and WIS, the workers can achieve a wage level that is enough for single elderly people to meet their needs. So hence the ratios are around 1 or slightly higher. But for working age parents, be it the single parent or partnered parent households, these 2 schemes only will lead to about 50 to 70% of actual needs. So the overall picture is clear. The PWM is adequate for a single elderly person, but significantly short for working age parents with children. I should mention that in 2023, so this year, the PWM has been extended even further, right, to the food services, waste management sectors, and so on. But because CPI data only exists for up to 2022, that's where the analysis stops. So in our report this time around, and actually starting from the 2021 edition of of the report, we have been recommending serious consideration of the living wage. The living wage is different from the PWM in that it is a universal wage line below which no worker should fall, and its calibration, right? The level of living wage is based on the calculation of people's basic needs, right? So that's what distinguishes the living wage. It's based on a very intuitive idea that has a very long history and kind of immediate social appeal, which is that work should pay decent wages, right? And that anyone who is working should be able to afford a decent standard of living, right? So we go through a series of calculations. I will skip the details here. But in our report, you can find an explanation for how we arrive at this figure. In order to achieve the MIS budgets, the amount that each worker needs to earn after the latest round of up-rating is 2,990. Right? So that's the wage level that we recommend all workers, full-time workers, should be provided in order to meet basic needs. We think it's a very reasonable figure if you compare it to actual median work income. Last year, in 2022, that was 5,070. So last year, median work income was already 1.7 times the living wage we're recommending. The entry-level wages under the PWM, unfortunately, fall about 28 to 53% short of the living wage level we're recommending. The next 4 slides I'm going to show you are comparisons to various policy measures, subsidies, public support schemes, and so on. There are a lot of numbers, but I'll kind of just verbalize the highlights for you. First, let's look at support for children. So here we compare households' basic income needs with a range of schemes such as the baby bonus, infant care subsidies, child care subsidies, student care subsidies, MOE financial assistance for primary and secondary school students, and finally higher education bursary for tertiary students. Right. The broad picture is this. We look at both the amount of support as well as the income limit. So this is the eligibility limit. So if someone's income surpasses this limit, then the person is no longer eligible for assistance. Some of you may think of this as the means test cutoff, right? So we look at both of this. The general picture with assistance for children or families with children is that the amount of support diminishes with the child's age. Right? So older children, so student care subsidy, for example, is worth a lot less than infant care subsidies. Well, if we look at the actual costs of children, they do not decline in a linear way. So this means that parents with older kids will find that will feel the financial pressure. The other feature is, of course, that the income limits also tighten for children of older ages. So less support, harder to qualify. I wanted to point out one column, the central column in the table, because we were focusing on changes that happened between 2020 and 2022, we were struck by how most of the schemes were not updated at all. So the amount of assistance was not updated, the means test limit was not updated. But this was a period during which living costs, in fact, rose quite significantly. So the real impact would be that parents would have found it harder to qualify for support, and if they did, the amount of help they got in real terms would have been less. Right? This lack of updating is something I'll return to again later on. Next, support for older people. So, the challenges with the Central Provident Fund, the CPF, are quite well documented. It's a scheme that's entirely driven by wages, right? So any inadequacies and inequalities that originate in the labor market are reproduced in retirement. We already know that. And because of these problems, our current retirement income regime requires heavy dependence on families, essentially adult children, grown-up children, in a shrinking population with shrinking family sizes. That is an issue. And therefore, this is a system, the CPS system, is one that requires ancillary support from other income measures. But what we discover is, because not much has happened to the CPF, except a slight update to the basic retirement sum, by $20. And so it reaches about half of an elderly person's basic income needs. It's important to stress that although it's only half, not all retirees actually even achieve this amount. So in 2021, about 1/3 of all CPF members who reach the age of 55 managed to achieve these figures. I mean, 1/3 did not actually reach the target saving amount of that will give them about half of their income needs. At the same time, when we look at the two primary income support schemes outside of the CPF, the ComCare Long-Term Assistance Scheme, the amount it provides, this was updated a little bit by $40 during the period in question, reaching about 40% of what older people need. So still a bit short, right? But what is more striking and worrying is the very low coverage. Because it is a very stringent scheme in terms of eligibility, not just the elderly applicant, but also their children are subject to means testing. The coverage is only 0.6% of the elderly population, right? And not 6%, but 0.6% of the elderly population. It is essentially a scheme that does too little for too few people. And then we move on to look at support for low-income households. Here, the pattern we see is one that is very characteristic of Singapore's welfare approach, which is that schemes either provide, the amounts provided are too low, or it goes out to too few people. Right? So in general, schemes that have wider coverage pay a lower amount. And you can see that here. The GST voucher cash, which in terms of the income limit is fairly generous. So an elderly person can have an income that's up to 1.9 times of their basic needs and still qualify. But the actual amount they receive under GST voucher cash is equivalent to only 1 to 2%. Right? It's about $33 a month, so it's not a significant amount. The ComCare short to medium term assistance provides more help, a larger amount, but then it's stricter, harder to qualify for. Right? Someone's income must fall to 39 to 56% of their basic needs in order to qualify. There were calls in Parliament to update the rules for ComCare short to medium term assistance during the period in question. Those were not heeded. A review in 2022 led to the conclusion that the rates did not need uprating. So the rules for ComCare short to medium term assistance were only finally revised 2 months ago, in July 2023, a full 3 years after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I must mention at this point that we are doing a review of changes between 2020 and 2022, and then some changes to policies did take place in 2023, but we don't cover them because we don't have the CPI for 2023, and so we can't revise the budgets according to that. We elaborate more on this in our report. Speaking of 2023, this year's national budget included a series of one-off measures, right, to kind of absorb some of the shock of inflation as well as the impending GST rate hike. This was a huge suite of measures: assurance package, cost of living package, various seniors bonuses, YouSave rebates, CDC vouchers, one-off baby support grant. It was a lot of policy activity, right? So that's worth taking note of. The coverage was quite remarkable. I think almost all adults and households received something, right? I think many of you will find these schemes very familiar by name. But when we added up the amounts that were given and compared them to the budgets that households need to meet basic needs, they add up to below 5% of what families with children need. A good reminder that kind of intense policy activity does not always lead to significant policy impact. In conclusion, right, we all have recalled that in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, many governments around the world introduced unprecedented emergency budgets. And of course, analysts were urging policymakers, ourselves included, to not just address immediate urgent needs, but also take the opportunity to rethink the structure of our welfare systems. Yet as we make a gradual return to normalcy in Singapore, it appears that even the pandemic might not have been enough to loosen the entrenched ideological resistance to social protection that had contributed to the precarities and inequalities that were so starkly exposed in 2020. Most of the pandemic-related interventions had a very short expiry date. Many have already ended. They provide temporary support without altering the fundamental assumptions and architecture of our social policies. Well, short-term crisis relief is just that, right? It does not repair and may in fact draw attention away from long-standing policy problems. We have observed that the official policy narratives have run ahead of meaningful change. Even as reforms remain tentative and incremental, there have been promises of a new social compact that recognizes the hardships of the past few years and that offers a fresh understanding of how state, family, and market can work together for everyone to meet their basic needs. So in that spirit, we make a few recommendations. The first is regarding wages. We now have a bit of experience and have some chance to observe the impact of the progressive wage model. Because it applies different wage levels across sectors and the amounts fall quite noticeably short of basic needs, it has, I think, revealed the shortcomings of a very fragmented sectoral approach to wage protection. We believe this presents a strong case for us to consider a living wage that prioritizes enabling workers and their families to achieve a decent standard of living. The second recommendation has to do with the retirement regime. I have already mentioned some of the challenges to do with the CPF, how it disadvantages especially people with disrupted careers who stop work to provide care for their family and so on, and as well as some of the constraints that we are still seeing in measures outside the CPF system. It appears clear to us that major reform is necessary, right, to alleviate financial pressure on family and to ensure that poorer retirees do not fall below a basic standard of living. Our final thoughts are about policy practices. Right? A few things are important that we've learned from the last few years. The first is to do with pegging. We also refer to it as indexing, which means making sure that policy rules keep up with the rate of inflation, so that policy rules, amounts of help, income limits to qualify are pegged to inflation rates, so that help does not shrink in real terms in those very moments when they are most needed. So that's one practice. With policies like ComCare short to medium-term assistance, the amounts given are still not regularly reported. We think that regular monitoring and transparent reporting is very important for us to understand the impact of policy. And of course, in the spirit of MIS research, we believe that accurate benchmarks must be used when these policy revisions do take place, so that the new policy rules are realistic to people's needs. We began this project around 6 years ago on the premise that there exists in every society a set of universal basic needs or a basic standard of living. And through this work, we have tried to establish what these needs are and translate them into precise household budgets through a process of consensus involving many ordinary members of society from diverse backgrounds. 3 years on from the outbreak of a pandemic that has compelled us to reflect on what it means to leave no one behind at this point of renewal, we hope that this study will continue to provide an explicit measure of human flourishing and a timely reminder of what still must be done to enable everyone in society to achieve respect, belonging, security, and independence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, both speakers. We now have some time for questions and discussion. I would like to point out that there are 2 microphones here and there. So if you have a question, can I please ask that you go to either of the microphones, tell us your name, organization, and state your question. In the interest of getting through as many questions as possible, please do be concise. So I will now hand over to the speakers for the Q&A session. You can come over for your questions. Thank you.
My name is Du Fei. I spent the last 20 years as a senior faculty at NBS, Nanyang Business School. I have a question on research methodology as an old academic. Did you ask your parents whether they would be willing to pay for all the services that you include in the basic need? Because I read your first report with great interest, and there are things that I've never seen, like excursions to Johor, birthday presents. I've never had a what is it called? A decorative around my neck in my life. So those were very nice things, and I was wondering how they come into basic needs, especially as a long-term Singapore taxpayer. Thank you.
Shall I go?
Yeah.
First of all, I'm very sad that you have not encountered birthday presents. I hope that's not true of most people. The process is important, the process by which we establish those needs. I say we, but actually we don't establish those needs. The participants do. We put them through quite a grueling process of focus group discussion. Again, I say discussion, but there is a lot of debate and negotiation because that is the nature of this method. Right? We put them in focus groups. We ensure that the focus groups are diverse. And then we do wave after wave of those groups. The general process is they first have to establish a definition of what is basic need. So there's a textual definition. That's the one that Yo-Yen showed earlier. This definition provides an anchor that subsequent focus groups have to we use it to challenge subsequent focus groups when we ask them to draw up an exhaustive list of all the items a household will need in order to achieve this definition. So people will suggest this and that item. And when they do that, we will come back with them with a challenge. Why do you need this? So we have asked them the same question. Why is a birthday present a need? And then people like to point out certain items. So what you mean by excursion is actually a holiday or vacation, right? So we will challenge them, why is this a need and not a want in order to achieve the definition of a basic standard of living. And then they need to argue it out. And no item enters the list unless there is consensus, by which I mean 100% agreement. And on those two items that you've picked out, I must say there was no controversy at all. Zero. So that birthday presents are a part of basic needs, there was no controversy. That holidays are a basic need in Singapore today. I think if you just look around the room and ask how many people have started going on holidays since it became possible, you will quickly get a sense of what the norm is, right? So those two were actually not some of the most contentious items, but we went through the paces all the same. Why? And I'll tell you why. And it's quite significant that those were the first two items that came out in the discussion because those are social participation items. People rarely will contest food items or transport. But with social participation, it feels like a soft item, right? So sometimes members of the audience would ask it. But once we get into the focus group and people start talking about what are basic needs, nobody disagrees that being able to feel a part of society, that means the thing that Yo-Yen mentioned earlier, being able to access those things and services that are considered normal in contemporary Singapore, right? Not 60s Singapore, not another country. That is important to allow someone to feel like a member of society. Family holidays serve other purposes, family bonding. Birthday presents are a way to show affection and respect. So people go through all these justifications. I'm just repeating what we heard in some of those discussions. And that's how we go about eventually creating this list. Is there anything that I...
Yeah. Just to add that in terms of the actual things, actual items, yeah, so because your example is sort of about accessories, for example, specific people may want different things, yeah, but the need itself is universal. So the need is partly about being able to gain respect in the social context in which people are in. So accessories, clothing, they have to be things that allow people to participate in things in society. So for a child, it may be participate among their peer groups. For a working adult, it may be to participate among their colleagues. For older adults, it's about participating within their family networks. Yeah? So the actual objects may differ, and participants were very clear that choice is important. Yeah, that not everybody wants exactly the same object, and choice is important. But the underlying need for respect and belonging is the same. As Scott Ho mentioned, these focus group discussions are a little bit different from other kinds of focus groups in that we're not bringing together like an aggregate of what all the things people want. It's that they are meant to reflect through the discussion through arguments, including through arguments, they're meant to reflect on what are the norms of the day. Yeah? So I think mobile phones, for example, is a very good instance where this methodology actually was started by a team in the UK, and they started doing this work in 2008. And when they first started doing the work, mobile phones were not on their list. Yeah, it was not seen as a basic need. Yeah? But after a while, it came to be seen as a basic need, right? Because mobile phones become things that if you don't have it, you cannot partake in normal things that everybody partakes in. I think that's a really good illustration of how material things very much sort of needs are very much social, yeah, and have to be contextualized socially.
And Andrew, I mentioned that I like that you picked out it was a trip to Johor, right? So when people talked about holiday, we were very struck by how reasonable the participants were, right? They said that a holiday is important for all those various reasons, including that if you live in Singapore, you need to get out from time to time, right? Otherwise, right? I mean, we know when people say that, we know what they mean, but then they quickly say that, but we are not talking about London or Paris. It's a basic need holiday. So in the end, they settled on something like, was it a 4-day, 3-night trip to Ipoh by coach? Not even Scoot, right? They said by coach, right? So that was the kind of the product of a discussion like that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Can I add one more thing? May I? The other thing I would add was actually that people are very aware of costs, and meaning that there is this strong sense that if we could not afford it, can we still put it on the list? Yeah, if some people cannot afford it, can we still put it on the list? So there is this sense that in the Singapore context, these participants are aware of the Singapore context and are aware that different people do have different means and end up spending different things in their lives. And we had to, in some ways, remind people that we really want to focus the discussion on the needs rather than on affordability first. Because it's important to establish what is the need before we figure out how do we meet those needs.
Shall we go to the next question?
Thank you. Hi, Prof. Teo and Dr. Ng. My name is Elizabeth. I'm a student with LKY. Firstly, I think as a former social worker, before coming to school, I really want to thank you both and the team actually, for according dignity to lower-income members of society through your methodology and not dismissing what they really believe are their needs. So my question now is, Prof. Teo mentioned earlier in the talk that the narrative about talking about what constitutes basic needs is starting to shift. I'm just very curious, is this shift happening primarily in academia, or is it also happening in the policy field? Because then my follow-up question would be, if it's more so in academia than it is on ground policy making, how can we interact with policymakers on this perspective of needs so that they can also see, I mean, it's reflected in the data shown that is not keeping up. So how can we engage with them on this reality? Thank you.
Thank you. I guess a public is constituted from many different kinds of groups. Yeah, and you mentioned sort of two groups, maybe the social work profession and people within the social service sector broadly, and academics. But the public, of course, is constituent of more than that. Yeah, I do think that when we've in the times that we've launched the report and in the many invitations that we then received to come and share our work, the emails that we've gotten about the work, we've seen interest from more than these two groups, I can certainly say that, yeah? That there are people sort of broadly speaking in the general public, students, people who see themselves just sort of as citizens of or members of this society who care about issues around poverty and inequality. Certainly, we've seen interest from journalists and the media. We've seen interest, to our surprise, maybe Kok Ho can say more of this later, from the actuarial industry from and banks. So I think that there is we see some signs at least, that there is sort of this broader interest, and when we give talks, we meet lots of people that we've not encountered before, and people who haven't necessarily paid that much attention to academic work on the issue. I think this, of course, doesn't mean that if you randomly, throw a stone on the street, you will hit somebody who knows about the work. But I think there are gradually more and more people who are sort of paying attention and interested in it. In the first round of work, I think particularly because we were talking about older people, there we did encounter, I think Kok Hu encountered, or met taxi drivers who had heard about it, or, sort of people kind of randomly coming up to us and telling us that they had heard about the work. But I think it indicates perhaps that people are using the work in different ways, and that some in their professional lives find that they can have usage for it, and others maybe in some ways at least beginning to be part of the discussion and conversation.
I'll just add a couple of comments. One is that there are sometimes the users that people find for the work, because it is a simple, because it's intuitive, but therefore a powerful thing to have, a benchmark of how much a basic standard of living costs, that you can think of so many users for it. So the actuarial community, that one is probably an obvious one. I see many smiles in the audience. You can see how it clicked for them, right? So we have been thanked for doing this work so that banks could mention it in their brochures, right, to sell instruments, right, savings instruments, and so remind people to save. Right?
We get no cut, huh?
Yeah, we get nothing. They just say, by the way, we use this, thank you very much. I mean, we laugh at it, but that too, do we welcome it? All such, engagement with the findings are welcome. And of course, personal savings is a part of the income security question. So we welcome that. Another kind of slightly surprising contact was an email I received some time ago now from an employer who says that he runs a small business and would like to think about how to use the findings to set wages for his staff. That made me very, very happy. I know it was one person, but that was a very welcome email. For social workers, the users of it, they were the community that I think already knew this in a way. When we said that these things are basic needs and so on, they said, yes, of course, we've been saying this, right? So in a way, they already knew. And for them, it could be a powerful tool for calibrating some of their own assistance schemes. We've received some notice from the larger international community. So this is not through any initiative on our part, right? Because we are very much focused on Singapore. But there's been an international NGO, B Lab, that certifies companies for social sustainability, including paying workers fairly. They reached out to us to ask if they can use our living wage calculation for their operations in Singapore. We welcome that. There is a global living wage network that was convened in the UK. They reached out to us, so we are now part of that network. I must also, of course, talk about that party I think you were most thinking about, which is government, right? I think it goes without saying you would be, if I say otherwise, I'll be lying. That is perhaps the toughest one to move, although it is the one we most want to. And we can understand the reason why. Over the last few years, we've learned also that government is not kind of a single unitary entity. There are different parts of government with slightly different mandates, and therefore we'll look at this issue a bit differently, right? I'll just say that, for example, if you were doing retirement income policy and you wanted people to save more, you would welcome a larger figure, right? So that you can advise people, look, you need to plan for a retirement, right? But if we're providing one of those social assistance schemes that I say only provides, 0.1 or 0.2 of people's basic needs, this will make you a little bit nervous, right? But I think I hope that through the last few years of doing this research, presenting it to the public, engaging different parts of the public with these findings, we have reassured everyone that as a society, we are capable of digesting findings like this, thinking about the information and using it intelligently and reasonably, right? So nobody needs to panic, right? I hope very much that is the message everyone takes away from this. Koki?
Yes. Hello. So I have a comment and a question. I think, so the comment for me is that I think it's very encouraging that because of the methodology you've used, I think it serves as a really powerful example of democratic processes, right? That people, when brought together, that can be applied across different issues and for policy making on so many different things, that when people come together and talk, they actually arrive at reasonable decisions and reasonable agreements, and that possibility, I think, is extremely encouraging and is a part of this whole project that needs to be highlighted more. You know, is that the spirit of what it lends, rather than just that ordinary people can decide what is needed for basic needs, but that ordinary people can decide, period, about our lives and what is needed to live together in this society, right? So I really enjoy that part of it so much. So my question was how much a sense of security about the future, and also on the flip side, fear of security about the future came up in discussions around minimum income standard for now. Because, and also how in that way you negotiate the failures of social protections and how that feeds into a minimum income, right? Because at least from my experiences working with communities and even with peers, there is a lot of an expression of I need to earn this much because there is no security for me in retirement, so I need to earn to save, and saving is a necessity, right? Like personal saving for like a healthcare crisis, because the healthcare system isn't something I feel able to rely on, and there's healthcare cost inflation too. So how much did that come up first in discussion, and also how, because it feels like a very complex thing to work into a minimum income standard, so I'm curious about how you negotiated that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. We talk about elderly, I'll talk about parents.
Well, thanks for saying that, Cookie. I enjoyed your observation about how this is a democratic process. Yesterday, I was just speaking to a group of very young students about what is happening to democracy around the world. So we spoke about populism, we spoke about polarization, we spoke about post-truth, and so on. And then I ended up saying that, research in its very small way, the good thing about a huge problem is that you can get at it from many different angles, and we do what we can. And from our role as researchers, what we can do is research like this, right? Think about the methods that we use. It is precisely a democratic process, the belief that ordinary people can answer this question, right? Just give it a go, right? Have some faith, give it a go. And when we give it a go, it worked very, very well. It turns out that people know lots of things, have very clear views, yet they are not afraid to compromise, hear others out, and be reasonable, right? That was very, very clear. So I like very much what you said about that. Especially in a society like ours, right, where decision making still tends to be fairly top down and elite based, right? The willingness to shift the center of gravity when we talk about some of these questions is really important. As for your question, anxiety, that was huge. And because we also meet researchers doing similar research in other countries, we notice how this research picks up on the anxieties, the different anxieties of different communities because of the social welfare systems and the gaps that exist in each country. So in a way, the anxieties of the participants in any one country reflect some of the things that people are worried about. With older participants, when they talked about health, it was mainly a conversation about health costs, right? How worried they were about falling, getting a serious injury, and therefore becoming a burden to their children. These were their words, becoming a burden. When they talk about health, they immediately think about money. When we spoke with our UK counterparts, when they talked about health, it was a shrug, right? And why? Because of the National Health Service. I know currently the UK is facing a lot of pressure, right? And they have their own problems to solve. Nonetheless, the policy landscape and what it provides shapes people's sense of security and anxiety, right? So in our budgets, we always do a calculation if you take away health, housing. So it's not just social protection in the form of assistance, financial assistance, but the cost, how we set the cost of basic public services that we all will need to use. The cost of housing, the cost of healthcare, and then the cost of education and childcare. If we change the model by which these things are funded, it will immediately slash the budgets that we've just shown you.
Yeah, I think this question, thanks for your question and comment, Koki. I think one of the methodological, one of the things about this approach that maybe is not super obvious when you just look at our budgets or the list, is that we learned not just the things people thought of as basic needs, but how they thought about basic needs. Yeah, what kind of language they use for thinking about basic needs, how they express what basic needs are, and what I suppose what they draw on from what they know already about society in order to inform the things that they put. So Kok Ho had mentioned already the anxieties for older people. A lot of it was around health and security, by which I mean physical security, safety issues. Among the parents, I think the issue of security and worries and fears of the future express themselves in most pronounced ways when parents talk about children's education and educational needs. So in our budgets, tuition is a basic need. And it was the component of the discussions that I think participants were especially energetic about. And particularly, there was a lot of angst in the room as they talked about education needs. Yeah? A great sense that this was a thing that they feel a lot of ambivalence about, in the sense of thinking whether this way of raising children with tuition or with so much focus on education is the best way to parent, and yet a great certainty that it is a basic need, because children need to be able to do well, and children need to be able to keep up in school in order to have secure futures. Actually, talking about that reminds me, among our youth group. So for the most part, when we talked about children's needs, we talked to parents, because for children in younger age, parents were the ones who told us what the children's needs are. But for the oldest group of children, between 18 and 25, we talked to younger people themselves to try to understand how they see their needs. And for younger people, education, and particularly university education, was something that they saw absolutely as basic. Yeah? And they were very clear about how if you don't have it, that has huge consequences for their futures, for future income, for future housing needs, food needs, everything. And they were also very clear that the state of society today is that, in fact, not all young people are going to be able to make it to university for reasons that happen, or inequality that occurs much earlier in their educational journeys. And so it was a really illuminating, I think those groups with the young adults was really illuminating, also in kind of their expression of this kind of trepidation about the future and the importance of education and the degree to which they can meet their needs in the future.
Thank you for so patiently standing. Yeah.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. My name is W2 Wong. I am a senior student between Singapore and Johor. Some layman questions, if I may. Who exactly reads your reports? Would your report be powerful enough to influence some changes in government policies? Another point which I would like to register, forgive me for not reading your report in advance, but have you considered the people from Southeast Asia and elsewhere who visit Singapore to arbitrage the cost of living? In other words, they work in Singapore, they make the big, strong Singapore dollar, and they bring the money back to their respective homes to have a better life. would we also consider using this arbitrage principle whereby Singaporeans move up to Malaysia to, enjoy a better value for the dollar? Now, I spent half my time in Singapore, half my time in West Johor, and I noticed that a good quality packet of coffee from the supermarket costs 7 Singapore cents. The same coffee in Singapore costs $1.20. So something is not right somehow. And considering the past decade of exponentially rising property prices, are we not paying for the profits of the landlords? So would some of these other points be included in your report, and to perhaps tailor it to be more easily understandable to people who are not as much academically inclined as you are? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting set of questions. This is always the question we answer nervously, right? Who reads your research? We hope everyone, but we think maybe some people do. But I mean, on a more serious note, right? We think about. Sorry, I shouldn't lean, then the mic doesn't pick it up properly. We think a lot about the accessibility of our research, right? Which is why the reports that Yuan showed you, we wrote it with a public audience in mind. I mean, we try our best to write it with a public audience in mind, and it appears as a PDF that's freely downloadable from our website, instead of the usual mode by which academics communicate their research findings, which is journals, for which you have to pay for, right? And very few people do outside of the university community. So we write for a public audience, we write in a mode that is accessible to the public. For the 2021 edition of the report, we also got it translated into Chinese and Malay. So hopefully it can reach even more people. And then we always say that we don't assume that research findings have their own links. So we provide the links. We give many, many public talks. At one point, I think in the first few months after we published the 2021 report, we were giving one talk every couple of weeks. Right? It was essentially a roadshow. And this was not us kind of initiating or soliciting opportunities to speak. It was requests to speak. So that was when we just went out to a lot of groups, right? There were charity organizations, schools, an elderly volunteer group, NGOs, and so on. We just kept going around telling people about our research. We try, but we know it's not easy. Right, so this is something that preoccupies us quite a lot. As for influencing policy, that's something I've mentioned. It's a hope that, of course, we have, and we keep working at it. There are clearly very serious cost of living concerns. I think that is a persistent issue. It doesn't go away. But in recent months, it's kind of re-emerged with a real vengeance. So I think when you ask that question, people were nodding and they understand. In a way, the specific instance, so I think the point of this round of study is precisely to capture some of those changes in the cost of living, right? So that the figures are realistic to people's current expenses and needs. As for the specific and actually really interesting instance of what you describe as arbitrage, right? Essentially, it's temporary migration, right? To and fro. Interestingly, we did an entirely separate study which was looking at homelessness and how that was triggered by the border closures during COVID because of people traveling to and fro. So I don't want to go into that because it's really a different topic. I just want to say that my first thought when hearing that is that migration to Malaysia to spend Singapore dollars there cannot be the solution to income security needs in Singapore. right? So yes, there is a neighboring country that we love, where things are affordable. From time to time we visit. But this is our society, right? And the cost of living issue is here. So if neighboring countries were also to do their own MIS, which I think would be really interesting, then that will capture some of these different budgets required in different countries. But the arbitrage is something that happens, but I don't think it's something that should diminish, I think, our concern, right, about actual budgets that are needed in Singapore and what needs to be done about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Singapore, like a lot of other so-called global cities, is very expensive. But unlike a lot of other global cities, we don't have a hinterland within our country. And I think that's why that's partly why sort of these concerns about cost of living take on a particularly urgent phase, and it cannot be resolved, I think, by telling people to move to less expensive spaces or cities.
Yes.
Thanks, Prof. Teo and Dr. Ng. I'm Hong Yi. I'm from the Straits Times. If you want my questions to be taken offline, I'm fine with that as well. But I thought I would just come and ask.
Go for it.
Yep. So fundamentally, I have two questions. The first question is about the risk of overestimation, because I understand the approach here is really to track how pricing trends have changed, right? But is it possible that during this COVID period, the profile of needs have changed as well? And if you don't reconvene the focus group to reflect for that, could there be an overestimation? For example, let's say maybe certain members of the focus groups could have seen what they perceive as basic needs contract, the profile of the basic needs contract due to the inflationary pressures, for example. And I also like to touch on it because that was basically the crux of, I recall in 2021, MOF had a rebuttal and all that, right? So that was what seems to me to
us? Just kidding. Sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, I know. So that seems to be like the crux, right? Like, because they spun a lot of things that had that additional abstract, what you refer to as the social participation element, as discretionary. So how could we reconcile that perception in policymaking circles that there's like a kind of the basic, we can stick with the basic kind of face value versus the abstract but still closely held needs? How do we reconcile that with policymakers? So I think those are my two questions in terms of overestimation and in terms of face value versus abstracts.
During COVID, part of our, in the last report, actually some of these concerns were on our mind. Would COVID and would living through those times of lockdown and then changes in work and family life, how would that shape what people's needs are? How would that shape how people think about what basic needs are? We could be overestimating, we could be underestimating, actually, right? So the question needs to be asked, how did the COVID times shift it? So in fact, we convened some groups during that time. It was online, huh? We did a few groups online because it was during lockdown, just to get a sense of how things may have shifted, which things may have shifted and which may have not. If anything, I think some needs actually expanded so that people, for example, talked about the need for a device for every child so that they can do home-based learning. Certain needs shifted in terms of, people felt like they don't need working clothes anymore because they're not going to work. But nobody saw that as a necessarily long-term thing. I mean, the need for being presentable to work still exists, right? It's just that temporarily, maybe the actual items you need for that have shifted, right? But for the most part, the bottom line is that for the most part, we found that how people think about basic needs and our definition generally, was still consistent. We were still confident, that the definition captured most of these things. And then actually many of our groups in that second report were conducted after lockdown had been lifted. So many of our groups, I remember everyone was wearing masks and we had to maintain social distancing in our focus groups. So it was conducted during that time. Again, I think some minor things shifted, but for the most part, the things that we captured in terms of social participation, access to work-life balance, education, for the most part, they stayed pretty consistent.
The point about overestimation, I think, is an important one to talk about, right? Because, I know what it's like. We look at the figures and immediately people will think, oh gosh, that's a lot of money. So it's not something we are kind of unaware of, because when we were doing the calculations, we have the same reactions as someone saying, oh, that's a lot of money, would, right? So the way the research process works is this: towards the end of I said many waves of focus groups, right? Towards the end of that long process, we are already able to calculate some preliminary budgets based on what the earlier groups said. So with the latest groups, the latest in that long process, we will show them the preliminary calculation and say, we've just spent, and they spend hours, right? So I say consensus. Our longest focus groups run for 6 hours. Right. I say focus group, you say, wow, it's essentially a full-day workshop. We provide lunch and tea and so on, right? Because there's a lot to go through. So, and I say the 6 hours because at the end of that long process, people know how every item on that list ended up on it. They came up with it, they argued over it, and they all agreed it has to be on the list. So at the end, we show you like, okay, so these are all the things you agreed on. Let me show you what it adds up to. This is the number. And of course, there was an intake of breath, right? When we show, then people said, then they will say, some people will say, their first reaction is that not everyone has this amount. Then I said, if you feel it's high, what items shall we then take out? That is not basic needs. They couldn't find things that they could all agree were not basic needs and therefore could be struck off the list. This was a part of the process that we also observed the UK team doing, say, so you could agree on the items, but now you don't like the number, right? So if you want to reverse the process, you want to strike some off, which ones? They can't. In the end, I think they said that maybe take off a few pillowcases or hangers. Then I said, that won't change the budget very much, right? They couldn't take items off the list. And I remember that the comment that left the deepest impression was one participant, he sighed and said, if it's this much, then it's this much. We should show people the number and talk about it. Right? There was frustration, right? So that was, I was just trying to share. I mean, rationally, what goes into the number, it looks high because it includes housing. And I think it looks high because we are thinking of how much I pay out of my bank account every month. But we are forgetting that we also are, for some of us, paying for housing out of our CPF savings. We forget that. And then there are what we call lumpy expenses that we often forget. Lumpy expenses meaning things you don't spend on every month, but you spend on once every few years, like your stove, your sofa, your wardrobe. You didn't spend on it every month, but you bought it at some point. All these things count towards the budget. We break it down. Right? So mainly it's these two things. Expensive items that don't come out of what people think of as disposable income is their bank account, as well as lumpy expenses. As for the specific rebuttal, we did speak about some of the we welcome critique. Academics actually we welcome this makes method better, right? It's how academics improve their work. We've spoken about it on a podcast at some length, both for ST's podcast, in your opinion, right? As well as a podcast we highly recommend, especially our episodes. The podcast
2 parts.
And then we did another interview with Social Service SG, a local podcast. We explained some of our responses to the critiques. Just point out a couple of things, which is that sometimes the critique is that perfume and jewelry should not be included because they are discretionary items. Well, the very point of this exercise is that no individual gets to say what is discretionary. To already decide, predetermine that some items are discretionary is to apply an expert view. Right? And that is precisely what this study doesn't want to do. If we wanted to do that, there's no need for any focus groups. We can just ask MOF what they think are basic needs, and then we'll cost those, right? We precisely don't want to do that, right? And in some of our discussions, we also wanted to point out that some of the items people pick on are quite sexist, right? So we noticed that people like to pick out perfume and jewelry. Why are you targeting women's items? Right? Because I think there is, in some parts of society, the view that women have vanity items, which are not basic needs. That's really unfair. Men have accessories in their budget too, right? People don't pick those up. And what we call kind of accessories and jewelry in the working mother's budget is $50 per year. Per year. That's less than $1 a week. They're saying buy the occasional hair clip or jewelry. Like I said, participants were very reasonable. So, I mean, that's the reality of our budgets. All our spreadsheets are online, and we invite people to look at them. They are very interesting. Yeah, I think that's all. Anything else?
Yeah, just a small point to add that I think change over time is inevitable as things change. One thing that I think if we did this work again in a few years, that may turn into basic needs, for example, is air conditioning. So actually this was not included in the basic need list this time, but we saw quite a lot of discussion about it because people were very aware of the increasing temperatures. Yeah? And particularly when parents were talking about children, I think it became sort of palpable that they are thinking about climate change, and they're thinking about what it means about higher temperatures, what it means about children's health, children's asthma, whether children can sleep at night properly, etc., things like that. Yeah. So this time they could not come to consensus that aircon was a basic need, but in another 5 years, in another 10 years, as our temperatures rise, that may well change.
Thank you very much for our questions. In the interest of time, shall we take one final one? Is that okay? Can I? Can? Okay. Just Kumar, please. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. I have two questions, but maybe you can decide if you want to answer both or you want to just choose one. So one question I have is, actually, what do you think, or what is your assessment of the causes of the price increases? Because there's a lot of literature on greedflation recently that's taken a lot of countries by storm. I think the person who's been arguing this is Isabella Weber, and she's now, I think, on the Times Face of the Year or something like that. So, but I've not heard this discourse much in Singapore. And so I'm wondering whether there is a case of greedflation in Singapore. Basically, greedflation means that prices are going up because of different producers' profit motive and profit maximization. Yeah. And okay, so second question is, I understand the choice of semantics, right? In that it's minimum income standards, right, and basic needs. But is there a hesitation, or is there some sort of methodological reason for why is this maybe not what we would consider a poverty line, right? And also, and I guess this is also in context of the absence of a poverty line in Singapore. And I'm wondering whether, do we have to wait for the government to say what the poverty line is before, for example, academics, NGOs, social service agencies all accept that actually this is the poverty line? As long as prices increase, as long as the cost of living increases, it will be the poverty line. Yeah, thanks.
Go for it. I mean, the first question, our sense of it, we don't, of course, analyze it in our report, right? We kind of, we observe what has happened to the cost of items that make up a basic standard of living, and when we analyze those, we don't study the causes. My sense of it is that some of the most obvious reasons, most of it is due to inflation, but that then just leads to the question of what causes inflation, right? So I think there are kind of the more obvious reasons, and then reasons that you alluded to. The more obvious reasons with fuel, it has got to do with global events and the disruption of access to the usual sources of petroleum and so on. So there are those sort of reasons. In the 2 years that we were doing this research, we also were monitoring food prices for a while. There were kind of near-term reasons that created some volatility, such as disruptions to our usual supply chains for groceries and food items. Some of those, I think, were picked up by our analysis. But the larger issues of actually who is driving and who is profiting from all this. For example, we know that the fossil fuel industry made a lot of money right, this last few years, at the same time as we are seeing cost of living go up and so on. So I think there's a lot to what you're saying, but it's not something that we've actually looked at properly or systematically in our research. The poverty line question?
This is actually when we did the groups, just to clarify, since we didn't actually set up this talk to have a lot of those methodological details, but our groups were mixed in terms of socioeconomic status. Yeah? And when people come together to discuss, we are telling them to think about a basic standard of living that we can apply to everyone in society. It is not meant to be only for poor people. It's conceptually, yeah, it's not framed as about poor people. It's framed as what can we agree should be a basic standard of living for everyone in society. Yeah, so it's not it's sort of just conceptually, we didn't think about it as a poverty line.
Yeah, and how do I put it? There is, we were quite careful. You mentioned the choice of terminology and so on, right? This research, even when it first originated in the UK, was not one that sought to measure poverty. There are many things that do that, many different research methods that try to get at that. But this research, even when it first started, had something to do with measuring what it costs for people to flourish and do well. It is still a basic needs budget. It's not a luxury and wants budget. But the idea is that flourishing is basic. Right? So I don't know if that makes sense, right? It is not it's not subsistence. It wants more than that. It is people whose lives are flourishing, but it does not have luxury items in it, right? So if we had to kind of boil it down to something very crude, right? It is above subsistence for sure. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about a whole range of dignity, respect, independence needs, and so on. But of course, it falls a long way short of even average income standards. It will be somewhere in between in the region. Right. I think that is all the time that we have. Thank you all for your questions. We'll now hand it back to Elok to wrap up.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
That brings us to the end of the launch of the latest report, Minimum Income Standard 2023 Household Budgets in a Time of Rising Costs. The full report is now live on our website. If you wish to check the budget for your household type, our website also provides a calculator that can generate the MIS budgets for any configuration of household for single and partner parents with 1 to 3 children. Yeah. We will leave the QR code and the URL on the screen so that you can access our full report. At the same time, please leave us a comment about this event. We look forward to more discussion about our report on our website or other methods. Members of our team will be happy to assist you to access the full report online if you have any issues. Thank you for being here and make this event possible. Thank you.